Yes, please do. It's now 10:03 and we have a quorum. I'll call the meeting to order and ask for the roll call.
Take your mask off.
The roll call.
Yes, President Deere, thank you. We will have our roll call for determination of quorum, starting with President Deere.
Here.
Vice President Houston.
Here.
Treasurer Alvarez.
Here.
Secretary Gray, who I understand is absent.
Yes.
And that brings us to our immediate past President Williams.
Here.
Okay, we have a quorum.
All right. Is there any public comment?
I believe we don't have, we have one public comment online. And so we have, I believe it's Lou Vargas. So please, Lou, you have the floor.
Lou, are you with us?
Yeah, she's talking. She's on the screen.
Is she on mute?
You're on mute. We can't hear you.
Is there a way to?
Now? We can hear you now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good,
Hi,
good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to have a comment regarding your budget. My name is Lou Vargas. I'm the utilities manager for the city of Manhattan Beach. I did have a comment last Wednesday, and I have a question regarding Prop 218. Is West Basin required to follow Prop 218? So I would appreciate if the board or the general manager can answer my question. And the second question that I have is that what is the true cost of NWD water coming to the city of Manhattan Beach without the CIP projects? The cost of NWD and what the city of Manhattan Beach is paying. What is the work that West Basin does that increase the price from the direct cost of NWD? And also, I would like to add that the city of Manhattan Beach doesn't support the rate increase that is being proposed in this budget for fiscal year 2022-23. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments and questions, and we appreciate that. Okay, so it appears we have no other public comments, and so the floor is back to you, President Deere.
Mr. Reed, can we respond to her questions?
Okay, so I have the first question as, does Prop 218 apply to West Basin? We don't have district council here with us at the moment. So I'd like to take that into consideration and respond back in our next board meeting with a response to that particular question.
Okay.
The next question is, we'd like to know the cost of MWD supply exclusive of the proposed CIP budget to Manhattan Beach. We have our manager of finance, executive manager of finance, Margaret Moja, on the line. And so I'd like to ask Margaret if you're able to provide a specific answer to Lou Vargas's question as it relates to MWD supply exclusive of the CIP.
Certainly, I'm happy to answer that question. So we will be covering that today in the presentation. If you have the presentation in front of you, on page 10, we do share what those rate increases are that are being passed through from Metropolitan Water District. Those were approved. Thank you for bringing it up on screen. Those were approved by the Metropolitan Water District Board on April 12th, I believe. I might be wrong on that date, but April 12th was the date, and that you can see there If we have a zero rate increase for the West Basin reliability service charge on our commodity rate and only pass through the Metropolitan Water District rate, both on the commodity as well as the readiness to serve charge, we refer to it as RTS, you can see that the total increase is $87 to effective January 1, 2023. And that would effectively be a 5.8% increase. If we were to increase the water reliability service charge from West Basin, and again, that is still being under review by the district here, that would be an additional $12 and at a rate of $99. One of it will go portion on July 1, and the other portion would go effective as of January 1, since that's when metropolitan water increases incur. And you can see that overall is 6.6%.
Okay, thank you for that response, Margaret. And then the third question, Julie, if you could help me with Lou Vargas's third question.
Is it the prop?
Prop 218 was question number 1.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Lou Vargas, if you may repeat your third comment or question.
Yes, I was asking, what is the true cost of the water without the CIP? Because I know the West Basin has a lot of CIPs. So what is the cost of just NWD water when you eliminate all your CIP projects?
Okay,
Staff can follow up with that.
okay, and let's, if you may, let me allow staff to put together a response, and we will get in contact with you, Ms. Vargas, to provide an answer to that third question.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for joining our presentation today.
Thank you.
So that takes us back to our President Deere.
Hey, we have no further presentation, no public comment,
No
Okay,
further comments.
no presentations, and no action calendar items. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, we'll go to the information calendar.
Okay, so that takes us to today's information calendar item concerning our long-range financial plan as it relates to our fiscal year budget for 22-23. And we have our executive manager of finance, Margaret Moja, prepared to brief the board and give a presentation. So I'll hand it over to Margaret. Please take her away.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, President Deere, members of the board, and our public. Thank you so much for joining us today in our series of workshops that have been reviewing the budget for fiscal year 2022 and the underlying assumptions that were here. The focus of today's workshop is to focus in on long-range financial plan. Certainly as we contemplate any one given presentation on a budget, having a long-term view, that lens, if you will, certainly helps us in understanding sort of the impacts on any given year, especially focused in on the year that we are dealing with. So we hope to share today those assumptions, not just in the 1 year, but in the next 5 years, and see, the input that we receive from the board, some of the things that should take under contemplation as we look to seeing how we can meet the needs of our district. And with that, if I could take you to the presentation itself. It begins on page 5 with the cover sheet, but if we again to go to again the next page, which is our mission statement. Again, always want to remind us the reason why we're here is to provide a safe and reliable supply of high quality water to the communities we serve. And certainly it's not just about the 1 year, it's about the long-term perspective. We've been here since 1947. We plan to be here much longer than that. And so we want to make sure that as we make decisions, we're thinking about it for today and into the future. So let's go over to the next page, which is page 7, and it's your workshop agenda. So today, again, as I mentioned, we will go through those forecast assumptions and then share out what that 5-year budget forecast could look like. We want to also share with you our current capital investment. Certainly, In order for us to be able to deliver that safe and reliable water, we've done so through imported water, but we've also made a significant investment within our recycled water system. And so understanding sort of what are those assets that are there and some of the costs that are associated with maintaining those assets on a go-forward basis is important for us to understand sort of how did we make that happen, and what does that mean for us as we think about into the future, what do we need to do? So as we look to that, we will then focus in our credit rating considerations, and we will have our financial advisors, PFM, here to actually provide some additional commentary for you. Again, with having that lens as well to make sure that we understand not just from a district's perspective, what are we handling there, but how are the investors, how are credit rating agencies looking at us, and we will go through some of those assumptions so that we understand again that the decisions that we make have a long-term impact to us. And then finally, I will just say I'd like to wrap it up with more maybe sort of posing some questions to us all on sort of where do we want to go with this information? How do we incorporate that into our long-term planning? And understanding very well from our other series of workshops that we've had that we want to make sure that we understand the strategic direction that the board is going. And I know there's been some comments about that, and how do we incorporate that into the conversation as we look to perhaps maybe look to a more regional sort of partnerships as it relates to providing that safe and reliable water. And with that, I'm happy to move us over to the forecast assumptions. And let's start with on page 9. So on page 9 here, as mentioned, the board for Metropolitan Water District did approve its overall rates and charges on April 12th. And you can see they're highlighted in yellow is the two numbers that were approved by the Metropolitan Water District Board. And so while it says an overall rate increase there, I want to just clarify, you've heard me say earlier through the public comment response that our numbers are slightly different than that. And the reason for it is that the overall rate increase is what it is to Metropolitan Water District. But they do have a mix of different types of water users, if you will. Those that are on the treated water, those that are on untreated water, those that are taking tier 1 water, and those that are taking tier 2 water. And so when you put all that together through their various rates and charges, their commodity charge, their capacity charge, their readiness to serve charge, all of those elements there provide an overall 5% increase. And again, those are done on a calendar year basis. So you can see a calendar increase on 2023 of 5%, another calendar increase of 5% in 2024. And then you can see the forecast after that. Again, none of those items outside of that red box on the right side have been approved by the board, but that's where they anticipate that those rates will be. Again, Metropolitan goes through a 2-year rate cycle and a 2-year budget. And so again, from about 2 years from now, we will have this, they will have that dialogue again. We'll be involved in that dialogue, and we'll see where those numbers are. But for the purposes of our forecast, we wanted to make sure we're including those long-term assumptions there because they do have an impact to us and and to our customers more importantly. So with that, I'm happy to move us on to the next page, which is page 10. And as I shared with you when we met on April 13th, we have put together a presentation and shared it out, I believe, on prior to the Metropolitan Water District's board decision. So I wanted just to share those numbers with you here today. And wanted just to kind of walk us through the schedule here just to make sure you understand sort of what those rate increases are based off of the decision by the Metropolitan Water District on what their commodity rate is, what is the RTS and what that corresponding impact is to West Basin and on collecting that RTS component to pay for that fixed cost. And then we've shown a couple options here, which relates to our own sort of increase, if again, that's still under consideration by the board, but just to give sort of a sense of sort of boundaries, if you will, on what we see here. So again, orienting ourselves on the schedule here today, when you take all those rate components there, we are paying $14.88, or I should say our customers are paying $14.88 for that. And again, it's made up of 3 components for that one rate. If we start with the scenario 1, again, their Metropolitan Water District rate doesn't change until January 1. And if we have no rate increase, our rate remains the same. The rate remains in effect until basically the end of this calendar year. Starting in January 1, 2023, that rate increase goes up by the change in the commodity rate from 1143 to 1209 on that individual component. And on the MWD RTS, again, we take a fixed cost. We know what our allocated share is from Metropolitan Water District. We know what our acre feet is. We then break that cost down on a per unit basis, and then we are able to see that that rate will go from 100 to 121, again, effective January 1, 2023. And our rate remains the same. So you can see just by passing through the Metropolitan Water rate increases, it goes from $14.88 to $15.75, an overall $87 increase, or 5.8% on our commodity charge. Now, there is also a capacity charge. I didn't necessarily share it here because, again, that one is one in which we're actually just passing through that cost as well. So, if we're being charged 100, we want to collect 100. We really are trying to alleviate, if you will, any differences between those two numbers, if you will. But if you go to the bottom side of the page, you'll see that scenario 2. And the only difference that you see there in scenario 2 is on that water reliability service charge, the RSC, as we refer to it. It moves from a 245 to a 257. West Basin changes its rates on a fiscal year basis. So that would change on July 1. So going from 245 to 257. And so you can see that when you see that rate increase, there's a one change on July 1 from 1488 to 1500, and then a second increase up to 1587 as of January 1. Overall, you see a $99 rate increase. 6.6 is the overall impact on just this component, if you will. And I will just make a note there, and I know the significance of rate increases and the importance of it in the environment that we are in today. But I will just note to you that our 5% increase is a negligible increase, if you will, to the overall commodity rate, less than 1%. All right, let's move on to the next page, which is a little bit more to the sensitivity analysis there. And I just wanted to share with you that we try to provide this analysis here and tried to update it based off of the Metropolitan Water District here. I do want to comment there in sort of the last minute edits that was there. I do need to make an edit here, and I will send out a revised page to you. But under option 1, again, if we were just to keep our rate flat, take in all of the rates and charges as it relates to our imported water rates, you can see that the overall effective rate is 5.5%. So again, Met is overall 5%, putting our rates and charges increases in our brings us to a 5.5%. But this is where the numbers change. The actual number for Pago funding, actually, my apologies for that error on this page, but again, I'll send out a corrected page. Instead of $5.2 million on Pago funding, it's actually a $4 million, and then bringing down our debt coverage ratio to a 1.19. And so you can see we are legally required to be at a 1.15. We like to strive to a 1.75 for the purposes of looking at ourselves to our peer agencies and to make sure that we stay in that AA category. And so rate covenants and debt coverage calculations and liquidity are very important into that. That's why we'll have a discussion later on with a presentation by PFM. But again, you can see that 119 there. If we move to this,
if I can interrupt you, please.
yes, please.
And I apologize. You went through that real fast, and I kind of
Sure.
lost you.
No, I understand. A lot of numbers at you. So happy to read through it again, and maybe then I can add in my editorials later if you would like.
Right. No, the editorials are fine. So we're looking at this sensitivity analysis chart, and then you said that the number here is different, or that's where I lost you.
Yeah.
Something got lost in the transaction. I just want to make sure I followed.
Yeah. So let me read the numbers across, and so that we have them all together, and then I can certainly answer any questions relating to it. So on the Pago funding, if I just go through that numbers across there, and again, my apologies for this last minute error, just noticed that this morning. Pago funding, first column, option 1 should show $4 million. Under option 2, 4.0 million. Under option 2, it's 5.4 million. Under option 3, it's 2.2 million. And on option 4, it's 3.6 million.
So these numbers are different than the ones on
Way
the chart.
different, yeah.
Correct. Those are different than that's there. And the reason for that is we had to make a last minute charge change, if you will, as it related to our standby. If you recall, we brought that up at the board meeting this earlier this week. And that was not carried through on this particular slide. And again, my apologies. And then I just wanted to clarify on the debt coverage ratio, those numbers also did change as well. So let me share that with you as well. That number is 1.19 under option 1. 1.25. Yes, 1.25 under option 2. Under option 3, 1.10. And under option 4, 1.17.
Okay, so question before we get off of this, just so that at least I understand. The difference in the Pago, why update the numbers, for example, under option 1 from 5.2 million to 4 million?
Sure.
What is that based on? And yeah, what is that based on?
Sure, absolutely. Again, there was two, I'll say, last minute changes that need to be incorporated into our into our 5-year assumption. One of them had to do with the standby charge collections. With the recent decision by the court, and when we received the information from special counsel as to the amount of claims, we were to set aside $1 million. We did not have that many claims that came through, and so we need to redistribute, if you will, the difference between that 1 million and the cost to be paid out to the claims and the cost to produce to run that claims process, if you will. And so that was about an $842,000 reduction on our standby revenues. The other portion of that change was for the RFP, the proposals that were due relating to our sludge hauling RFP, and that came in at a higher cost for than we anticipated into the budget, and the tune of about $350,000 to $400,000. And so between the two of them, again, those two numbers were not reflected on this particular page. So you'll see it reflected on the last page, and I think I just overlooked this particular page.
Okay, so these numbers, the Pago numbers, are really based on what's left in the budget. In other words, you go through, you pay everything else, and then you say, if we have this revenue after all our expenses, we got $4 million for capital improvement projects, and that's all we have.
That is correct. Thank you for that, making that point clear. Yes, this is not necessarily what our Pago dollars what we identify as Pago projects, but what our funding is towards those types of projects. So you could say net revenues, you could say deposit into designated funds or reserves. But yes, those are basically the difference between revenues and your expenses being your operating, your debt service. It would be what's left over. And because of the reduction in revenues and the higher costs, those both reduced the amount available to support your Pago funding.
My simplistic way of thinking, I could think of this instead of Pago funding, it's funding available for capital improvement projects.
Correct.
IP funding availability. Okay.
Yep. Thank you. Yes, very good point. Thank you. So as you can see, thank you for going through that exercise with me. And again, I'll get you an updated slide so that you have it for your records. But wanted just to share that, again, fiscal year 22-23, a bit more challenging for us than it has been in the years past. But you'll see a 5-year forecast where things are not as low, if you will, on the debt coverage ratio. But several of them are very close to sort of borderline at our debt coverage ratio, and one of them actually draws below. So one of an area of concern, and so certainly wanted to be very mindful of that as we look into 22-23. Director Houston, I saw you come on and you might have a question.
Sure, Mr. President, if it's okay, really fast. And actually, Margaret, you just pointed out, so yeah, option 3 with your revised numbers, you actually have the debt coverage ratio of 1.10. So by that, technically, we would be under the required minimum on option 3.
Correct.
So,
And just to clarify that option 3, what we meant by that and the 5% reduction is the reduction on our water sales assumption. So we had, spoke at our workshop on April 13th. If we were to come back and say, you know what, drought conditions, people are really responding, we need to, lower our water sales assumption. You can see there that if we just make that particular adjustment just in the budget, that would be something that we would need to take into consideration. Is it an increase, more increase in rates? Is it cut of costs? If that was the chosen option here. Again, I would say that right now we've already are showing a reduction in our water sales assumptions from where we are currently today. They appear to be the same because of a capital project that is having one particular refinery customer take additional sales of potable water sales during that construction period. But we really are at a reduction here. So we're hopeful that, the budgeted sales that we share with you do reflect in option 1 or 2 do reflect sort of where we anticipate to be at the end of the year.
very good. Thank you.
All right. With that being said, was there any more questions on this particular slide?
Well, let's go back and just think about on option 3. What would be required to keep that debt coverage ratio at 1.15 if you're working your way backwards? Would that mean that you would just have to pay for some of the imported water from the reserves? And therefore, your overall net operating revenues would still be sufficient to cover your debt coverage ratio?
You couldn't take reserves to pay for your imported water purchases. You would have to, like I said, either cut costs in order to get there. And again, you can see a 116 is fairly close to that, and the difference that I've shared with you from a 3.4 now down to a 2.2. So we're talking about $1 million in cuts or $1 million of rate increases, which would probably be another 5% on top of it. So that would be something that, again, we would need to have that dialogue with the board.
Okay, just kind of working, since this is kind of a working session. So there's 2 ways to get to this, to a 1.15 ratio. One way, if I understood you, and this is the question, is we just reduce our overall budget by $1 million, and that we're doing $1 million in budget cuts.
Correct. So that would be from your program expenses. These are ones that, it would be any one of your program expenses from recycling operations, public informations, technical planning, water use efficiency. Those are the areas that we would need to look at in order to make those additional cuts. Again, the other assumption is that you change it's not a 5% reduction. I suppose you can look at it this way. It's not a 5% reduction on water sales. It's maybe 3% reduction, and you can achieve it that way because for every acre feet that we sell, we do earn $1, if you will. So, or $245 at least for everyone that's there. So that's another way to look at it is maybe it's not a 5% reduction, it's a different reduction. So there is, I'll say, a third option out there. So any other questions on this slide? If not, then let's move over to the next page of the document, which is page 12. And again, this starts getting into sort of our forecast assumptions here. And we wanted just to share with you that you can see what our water sales assumptions look like over the next 5 years, including starting with fiscal year 22-23. We are budgeting 103,200 for our imported retail. Again, that does show a slight increase of about 1,900 acre feet for Chevron because of the project that we're doing over at the facilities. While they're doing a turnaround, they will need to draw on potable water or imported water in order to make those sales occur. You can see we do sell to the Dominguez Gap, and we can see the numbers that are there, and then also West Coast Barrier. With a recent conversation that we had with one of our customer with our customer there for the barrier sales. We do understand that there's a project that perhaps is coming online towards the end of this 5-year period of time in either calendar year 24 or moving into 25. And so if that is the case, the assumption that we have here about 3,000 acre feet in fiscal year 25, 26 and 26, 27, that actually could drop to zero in those particular 2 years. And if it were to come in on towards the end of calendar year 24, you could actually see that that fiscal year 24, 25 could also drop as well, but probably just by half. So we are assuming this number here, and as we continue to monitor with the customer as how that project is going over there on Terminal Island by putting in that second line for the recycled water, as well as having that potable backup, eventually these Dominguez sales, if not in this 5-year period of time, it is a sale that is no longer going to be here for the district to rely on for some of its rates and charges. And then you've got your West Coast barrier there. You see that it's a little higher this year for us as it relates to the West Coast barrier. And that is because we're still dealing with the remnant effects, if you will, of the Hyperion spill. And as we sort of transition out of that particular things, we do anticipate getting to a more regular sort of schedule, if you will, as I say, sort of a return to normal as it relates to our West Coast barrier, really getting the sales from the recycle side as opposed to from the imported side. And then just and overall, we do understand that, that we are looking to see how we can have our constituents, our customers, the public respond, to these drought conditions. And so that's why you see that decline on our imported retail sales. But we also know that our groundwater pumping, there has been increase in our groundwater pumping over the last couple of years. And so we do anticipate that coming through as well. And that's why you see that gradual decline that's there. All in all, taking overall the impact of the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan, understanding very well that it's a planning document, but understanding that if those things come into fruition, that's where we anticipate some of our numbers could be. And so we're trying to make sure that we're accounting for that within the budget, but every year making sure that we just sort of check in and see where we're at with it. So you can see that over this 5-year period of time, our sales are dropping about 10,000 acre feet over that period of time. Gradually. So let's move on to the next slide, which is slide 13 of your presentation. And this is another important aspect to us. And the reason we focus in on the rates and we focus in on our assumptions for our water sales is because this is the large driver, if you will, of our budget. About 90% of our revenues do come from these two sources of water sales. So for here on our recycled water sales, we do have our 5-year forecast here, and we've broken it down by our different types of water types that we do provide. So for disinfected tertiary there, you see some gradual increase there. You can see that largely it's increasing in fiscal year 23, 24, but more notably in 24, 25. And that is with the completion of the PV lateral. That is a project that the board has approved and we're moving forward on. It's about 200 acre feet that we anticipate seeing there. We also see some minor increases in other areas there. We have some other projects that were shared with you. And those projects that were shared with you back on April 6th included the Inglewood Basketball and Entertainment Center, LA Southwest College, LA Stadium, Torrance Tech Center, and the Northrop Grumman Irrigation Extension. So again, those are the anticipated sales that we see over that over this 5-year horizon on those particular ones. At the barrier, it's sort of the opposite story of the on the potable side, which is we have more potable in the first year, and then it drops down. Here it works the other way, which is as we are able to get back to operations with our barrier, not having to shut it down for water quality issues, we're able to then provide an increase, if you will, in our barrier sales for recycled water. On the refinery side, you can see the number is lower in fiscal year 22, 23. That again goes back to that Chevron nitrified project that I referred to there, that tank replacement. So as that tank replacement is done in that 1 year, you can see that those sales returned back to their normal level. On the low pressure, you can see that number does increase over the fiscal year 23 and 24, as well as 24 and 25. And again, that is with the completion of the phase 2 project that is happening over in Carson, another project that's currently underway being constructed. And then finally, our high pressure sales to the city of El Segundo for Chevron boiler feed, those remain constant during this period of time. And as always, we continue to monitor that with you on a monthly basis with the board, and do share that the financial aspect of that on a quarterly basis when we do our quarterly budget versus actual. But you can see that these are what our anticipated sales are and what we reflect in our 5-year budget. So if I can take your attention now to slide 14. Some other important revenues for us here is our standby revenues, as well as our fixed capital payments. And as previously shared, and I'll just elaborate on it here a little bit more, the district was provided a class action suit back in 2017 as it relates to the standby revenues. There was a settlement agreement that was negotiated, if you will, in October 2020. And by April 1st of 2022, the judge finally approved that settlement agreement. And what that does, it essentially winds down, if you will, our standby charge program over an 8-year period of time. So what I have shared with you here is what those anticipated revenues are. And it really is about your unit that is charged, and that's established by a resolution each year, and based off of that now a court order. But it's also based off of the number of parcels or acres, if you will, depending upon how it's charged. But it's you can see that is declining in the first 3 years, and then based off of the settlement, it increases for the remaining years. But you can see that we have about $6.2 million in fiscal year 23, $6 million in 24, and dropping down to $5.7 million in 25. Then it goes back up to 7.6 for the remaining years. And so all told, over this next 8-year period of time, we anticipate an additional about $56 million of standby revenues. Again, those have been factored into our 5-year forecast. And then on to the bottom side of the page, we have our fixed capital payments. With those, we do have certain agreements with the refineries that have agreed to pay for certain costs relating to capital, sort of supporting us and themselves, if you will, by contributing towards the cost of putting that capital investment in place. So based off of those agreements, we anticipate about $8.3 million in fiscal year 23. It drops down to about 5.8 million in 24, further drops down in 25 and 26, and I should say 27. My apologies for the typo there. The reason for that is that there are different times in which these agreements are set to expire. And so, for instance, our refinery with Torrance is set to expire in August 2023. Chevron nitrified expires in 24, Marathon expires in 25, January 25, and then the Chevron boiler feed expires in September 27. And what this indicates is that based off of just current agreements, what do we anticipate receiving? And let's reflect those numbers here. What it does not show is that we have future projects that are planned, and we intend to negotiate with the refineries to work with us to help pay for those costs there. So as those negotiations occur and we understand what those numbers are, we can start to incorporate them into our 5-year forecast. The costs may be there because we see them as being important for us to continue to have those on-site or off-site improvements. But that being said, we have not shown the revenue side of it there. So it could be a positive for us into the future. We just don't know what those numbers are. And so that there shows you about a $22 million of fixed capital payments over this 5-year period of time. All right, so let's move over to the next page, page 15, which just touches on briefly about our expenses. We do anticipate passing through those MWD rates and charges of 5 to 7%. Actually, it's more the reverse. It's 7%, followed by 6%, and then going down to 5%. But we have incorporated that into our into our 5-year model as well. For the purpose of this budget, we have shown that staff remains constant during this period of time, no increase in staff, as well as that there's moderate increases in our program expenses. Typically, we use about 3% to reflect that there are sort of cost of living increases associated with the programmatic expenses. It also incorporates our debt service of about $21 million per annum and about $811,000 coming in around fiscal year 24 as it relates to the 2 state revolving loans that we have, one for the PV lateral and the second one having to do with the phase 2 project. So again, just under $1 million additional amount that's there. So if we go to the next page, it shows you this chart that I've shared with you before. But again, this is sort of what our debt portfolio looks like. And again, very important for us to understand that. So as we have those declining revenues, we are also seeing some declining in expenses. Are they matched up in the way they need to be? And if not, what do we need to do in those in-between times? And again, I keep referring to a 5-year forecast. Certainly the district staff does look at it a longer period of time. What we share with you is a 5-year forecast because those are the more immediate knowns, if you will, for estimating. So let's go on to page 17. So 17 here is our proposed 5-year capital expenditures. Again, you've seen the slide a few times, both in the April 13th workshop where I just shared a highlight with you, and then again in more detail shared last week on the April 20th workshop regarding our capital budget. And you can see a fair amount of those costs are incurring, if you will, not only in fiscal year 22, 23, but if you look over the 5-year period of time in our R&R component. Now, I know that there's some discussion underway with the board and staff regarding those particular projects. And so in one aspect, it's, the dialogue that we're having today on the long range financial plan is not so much about the specific dollars, but to understand sort of our approach on how we will address some of these numbers here. Will we be having, $157 million in this 5-year period of time? If it's 120, we're still going to have to, figure out how we're going to be able to pay for these projects if we deem those projects to be necessary. And I understand, again, we're continuing to have those dialogues. I believe that there's been a request for another workshop in May to go over our CIP budget so we can see how those projects that we have identified align to sort of where our strategic direction may be in being, working with our regional partners going forward.
I can interrupt you for a second, Margaret.
Yes, please, go right ahead.
Okay, so for the rest of the presentation, you are assuming a capital expenditure budget of, at least for FY 22-23, of $58 million?
Yes, we are assuming what is on this page here. Now, I will say that in that assumption, I will say that I've shared numbers on how I would break down if we were to fund them with Pago or fund them with debt. But certainly from a go forward basis, they have not been necessarily incorporated into that that we would go out and necessarily get new debt or that we would use our reserves. I believe that what I was hoping for in this conversation today is understand sort of where the board feels comfortable on moving on some forward on those directions there, so that we can see how that would be integrated, if you will, into the budget assumptions there. You'll see some very nice high numbers there, but that doesn't assume that I've now debt financed, half of this number, for instance.
Okay, but along those lines, just to kind of try to put things in perspective, because that alone is a huge number of $58 million, and we're ill prepared to address that, nor is it a wise investment in any event. The new infrastructure, most of that comes out of the expense that's already committed for the phase 2 improvements at the Millennium McDonald plant, correct?
Correct. Of about the $58 million that you mentioned there, my recollection from last week's workshop, about 45% of that number does relate to 2 particular projects. That is the PV lateral and the phase 2 Carson projects, which again are well on our way. One's under construction, one's near final design. But what's nice about those two particular projects that we've got a fair amount of, I'll say, outside funding as well as a state revolving loan, if you will, that we can use. That is, a nice rate. I believe the PV lateral is at a rate of 0.55% for the $3.9 million loan that we're able to get for that. And for the approximate $15 million for the Carson loan, it's about 1% on that one. And so those two are the two committed there. The others, if you will, and actually, if I could actually turn your attention to page 18, maybe it will help us to answer some of those questions there or see sort of where it is. So to your point, we do have sufficient a large number, if you will, that's coming from external funding, either grants or from customers, of a tune of just under $20 million. We do have a state loan proceeds that are coming in to help pay for that project as well. So at question here is that next number, which is that $29 million number in fiscal year 22-23, or if you look on a 5-year basis, which includes 22-23, about $120 million. How is the district going to be able to move forward on that? And what do we do? And I'll have a slide a little bit later on that kind of reflects on how do we, if I just take, sort of internal staff process, if you will, and apply some of it to Pago and some of it to debt, is that what we want to do? Is it, and I know, again, there's questions about some of those projects, and so we can go through those projects as well, and then see what we're in. Because if those projects are not happening, I don't have to worry about, of course, funding them. So again, important to know where the board is moving forward on those projects so that we understand how we need to respond with the financing associated with them.
So that's where I wanted to at least try to clarify.
Right.
Basically committed to the two projects that you mentioned, the phase 2 improvements, the Melinda McDonald plant, and the PV lateral. And there is, in addition to the cost being incurred by West Basin, quite a bit of external financing in the form of either a revolving loan fund money, which is still money that we're going to owe, or participation and out grants that offset some of those costs. With respect to the other categories, the rehab and replacement and additional recycled water projects, by recycled water in this case, I mean recycled water laterals, we have not made any commitments to any of those projects. So these numbers that are in here, I know that they're based on kind of a hodgepodge of potential projects that have been thrown out, but those projects have not been vetted and are not necessarily something we need to commit. So when we're looking at this, my question then would be, one, we're really not committed to spending this much money, but if we're looking at future expenditures, this would be there may be other projects and other directions that this would be that could be funded, and these numbers could be considered that way.
Right. Absolutely.
I do believe this board needs to make a decision of where it wants to invest and what we want to do moving forward. Okay.
Thank you. So with that being said, I wanted just to take us now maybe to the next section, which is our 5-year forecast. So if we can turn to page 20 of the presentation. So in page 20 of the presentation, as I shared with you, the numbers that you see here do reflect the following assumptions. It does assume that we pass through those Metropolitan Water District rates and charges. It does assume that we have a 5% increase on our water reliability service charge. Again, I know the board has not made a decision, but for the purposes of just providing context, you can see that there. It does include our SRF repayment, but no additional long-term debt because we need to see sort of where we're at and see if we have the capacity to add any additional debt. And again, that's based off of the board's review of those capital projects, and we'll see going forward. And it does not include, there was a footnote on the previous page about the additional anticipated CIP costs of about $73 million. So again, when we are reviewing those projects, that $73 million were projects that are looked to be into the future, just not starting here in fiscal year 22-23. So with those assumptions underway, you can see sort of where we're at. And again, in fiscal year 22-23, you can see a debt coverage ratio of 1.25, bringing in net revenues or monies available towards capital investment of about $5.4 million. And the next couple slides will go into sort of what is in the revenues and expenses. So I'll just talk sort of in general, and then we can go into the details underneath it.
Okay, so just for
Yes.
clarification, on your assumptions, you said it does not include the anticipation cost of CIP cost of 73 million, but it does include then the $58 million.
Well, again, we'll have a slide in a few pages, page 23, that will go through that there. What it does sort of contemplate is that if we're only going to go forward with those $58 million of projects, and we've got our grant funding, and we've got our customer funding, and we got our state revolving fund, we have $5.4 million to pay for $29 million. So what are we going to do? Are we going to issue debt? Are we going to draw on reserves? Or to your point that you've made, Director Alvarez, is are we even going to have these projects? Because if I'm not going to have those projects, then I don't have to worry about putting additional debt on, or I don't have to draw additional reserves down on my reserves.
Okay, but for purposes of discussion,
I'm leaving the question open, I suppose, is what I'm saying, which is I wanted to show you without sort of that capital investment here, what situation are we in? And then as we make that decisions on the capital assets, then we can come back and says, what is that corresponding impact? So again, fiscal year 2022-23 is a very tight year for us. It's a very, very narrow margins, if you will. We in 23-24, with those assumptions that I've shared with you, you can see we're in a better place, but that also does not assume that I've put in any debt. So if I start to put debt in there, that's going to put downward pressure on that coverage ratio, and it's going to perhaps have net revenues be less than that. So it depends upon how, again, we want to approach it. Do I want to use $12.8 million, for instance, in 23-24 towards capital projects? But what if I have capital projects that are greater than that? And so that's the question at hand. And so that's what we need to, continue to have a dialogue about. And that's why when we're putting the budget together, it's not always about the 1 year. It's making sure we understand the long-term aspect. And so wanted just to share numbers without sort of the assumption that I'm going to issue debt. I can certainly show you what those numbers look like, but I have at this point have not, knowing very well that we're still debating or dialoguing is a better word, on what are those capital projects.
Okay, but just so that I understand, the numbers that you have in here implicitly have the $58 million for 22 or 23.
I think the answer is yes. It includes the Table A projects, right, Margaret?
Correct.
And that would be over the 5 year, that would be like 157 million.
Right. So that's based on a lot of projects that have not been approved. But it's okay if it's, I just wanted to clarify what it's based on.
All right. So, and again, in the out years, we also are seeing ourselves where, again, we're returning to sort of higher numbers, if you will, as it relates to net revenues, a higher debt coverage ratio. But again, if we decide that we're moving forward with projects and we're going to use debt financing for it, it will start to put pressure on both of those numbers there. And we won't have those numbers available. And I think that's important as we have that discussion going forward, on these projects and how we're funding them. We need to understand, if we need to have these projects and we want to use Pago, for instance, or use our net revenues or our reserves for it, we need to make sure that are we setting our rates at an adequate level? Is that going to be enough? And that's sort of, we're in this position of, we need to understand where the projects are going so that we understand how we respond in this 5 year forecast, for instance. Let me just go to 21 and 22, which again just shows you in more detail sort of what those numbers look like on our numbers. So, you know, the 236, the 242, that bottom line number that you see there, total operating revenues, you see that number carry forward onto that previous slide there. So you can see the details that you can see there, and you can see where the, you know, the standby charge is, you know, well, declining and then goes up for the last 2 years. You can see the fixed capital payments dropping off. You can see that our fixed service charge remains relatively flat, similar with our other revenues. The increases you see in the imported water is assuming again that we're passing through metropolitan water rate increases, as well as the district's 5% on its reliability service charge, and our recycled water rates, recycled water revenues, that increases based off of the acre feet assumption and those rate increases that are allowed per agreements. And then on page 22, you see the expense side of it. Again, the numbers that you see there, a couple things that I just want to note there. Again, imported water purchases, the reason you see the increase there is because of the increase in the MET cost. And the decrease, so it's a combination of increase in MET cost, but also decrease in the amount of acre feet assumption. So it stays, you know, relatively flat, but the reason, you know, it's the corresponding offset between those two. Recycle water operations, you can see that that goes up in fiscal year 23, 24, and that's because we assume a higher amount of acre feet being produced in that particular year. Debt service, you can see, remains relatively flat with the exception of that small bump up, if you will, for the state revolving loan loans repayment. And then our other program expenses, you see it drop down actually in 23, 24, and then remain relatively flat. And that is because in fiscal year 22, 23, we actually are making a I'll say a one-time payment to our partnership share with the city of Los Angeles for potential regional project. And as a result of that, you can see that that number shows up there in that 1 year, and then it comes off in the following years. And then you can see, I did say it here, available for designated funds. You can see that that's what's available for us. And that's sort of that question is that money sufficient for the projects that are there? So without the sort of this final decision about what those projects are, let me take you to the next slide, which says, how do we address what our projects are? So I've already shared with you sort of what is that district funded page. And if I just maybe have you go side by side to sort of what that is, it's on, my apologies, I should have had it ready. Page 18 of your packet, and then compare that to page 23. So on page 18, you see there that I was saying, assuming that we're moving forward with those projects, again, I know that's still under review, but assuming that we move forward with those projects, we have about $29 million in fiscal year 22, 23 that I need to fund. And based off of our internal practice of identifying what ones will get funded with Pago or reserves, and which one would be funded with debt financing, that's how we would do that. So we have $18.2 million that are going to come from Pago. Those are your shorter term assets that we would then use Pago funding for. And the balance of that $11 million would come from debt financing. But you can see that available from district net revenues is 5.4. So now I have the question, well, how am I going to solve this problem? I have only 5.4 million coming in. And if I just look to that top line, $18.2 million, I don't have enough money coming in to pay for those projects. So what do I do? Do I, move that to the debt financing line? Do I draw on reserves? And even before all of that is, if I don't have $29 million I have to fund, then that's, it's a different question. But it really, regardless of the numbers, it's still sort of that question that is between, the board and staff and management to figure out how are we moving forward on being able to fund these projects on a go-forward basis, knowing very well, too, that there are other considerations into the future that the district may be contemplating. And so that just gives you an example in fiscal year 22, 23. You can see in 23, 24, we're in a similar situation. We're not bringing in enough revenues, net revenues, to pay for our Pago related projects. Similarly, in 24, 25, we're also not bringing in enough revenues that are there. Now, when you get to 25, 26, based off of those projects, we would have saying, oh, I'm only having 6.5 million coming out of there, but I might be pulling in 15.5. So you could, in that particular year, say, you know what, I don't want to debt finance those costs. I might want to choose to use Pago instead. And then more importantly, in 26, 27, you actually have $17.6 million based off of assumptions that you're bringing in, and I only have $10 million worth of projects. And so you can say, good, we can actually set aside some money for some future projects beyond this 5-year period of time. So overall, you can see in that sort of 5-year period of time, we're bringing in about net revenues of about $64 million and Pagos of about $63 million. So that kind of offset there. So our question is, we've got some projects there. Again, if we were to move forward with all those projects, of about $57 million that we need to fund. And how are we going to do that? Is that going to be, through debt financing? If we're fortunate, maybe we can get some customer funding and or some grants associated with it. And so again, these are the specific numbers that are given us here. And again, the numbers will be different as the board, shares their input about what those projects are going forward. But that's the question at hand. How are we as a district going to be able to move forward on paying for some of these capital projects? And so there are different ways. We can, draw on reserves, and we'll show you what that looks like. If we decide to take that process, if you will, we can issue CIP, or we can, let's just say we want all the projects, we just have to maybe move them out a little bit so that it's not such an impact, if you will, in this 5-year window. But again, there are considerations for each of those because, again, I have not built in that $57 million into our 5-year forecast. So if we decide that those projects are moving forward, we're going to need to now show what that debt financing looks like. And even if you use commercial paper, you're still going to have to incur some costs associated with it. And so that's the question at hand, and one that I don't think is necessarily needs to be solved today, but one that I think as you are reviewing and contemplating sort of where we're moving forward as a district, this is one of those considerations as well. So with that, I'll take a pause there because I know that was a lot of information there. But again, I see this as the beginning of the conversation and something that we will continue to dialogue with you in conjunction with the decisions that are made on the capital side.
Okay, so as we pause, I do have some questions. I'd like to focus on FY 22-23 since the budget is at hand.
Sure.
You have on the chart, you have 3 categories: Pago reserves, debt financing, and total district funding. So that is the total capital cost. If we go back to the previous table that I had previously been discussing, of the $58 million in projects, correct?
And I wanted just to clarify. So Pago reserves and debt financing, the sum of those two equal that third line item. It's not a third line item. It's the sum. Sorry, maybe I should have done a nice underline there, but the 18.2 and the 11 million make up the 29.2. I want to make sure that that was clear. It's not a third line. It's the sum of the 2 lines.
So that was part of my question. How do we interpret this? So we're only talking about for CIP then, for 22-23, $29 million, not $57 million.
Right, because of the other 57, and again, if we just bring up that slide 18 again, the other dollars, if you will, is being paid for through grants, customer funding, or through state loan proceeds. And so that same 29.2 million, that's that question of like, how are we going to pay for 29.2 million? And that's what I'm trying to show with you on slide 23.
Okay. Let's go back to then the CIP funded / reserve line, the first line. So of that 18.2 million, if we go back to page 11 of the presentation, 4 million was what's available in the CIP financing, assuming option 1.
Correct.
And so you're really looking at taking out of reserves this year, about $14 million?
So, so again, if we were moving forward with $29 million worth of projects that are not being funded with some other source of funding, and we said we are moving forward with projects, $29 million, if all the district does is bring in $5.4 million, I need to do these projects, yes, we would have to draw the difference between the two, or $24 million down from our reserves. Now, it's a decision. I'm not sure if it's a good decision, because it has a corresponding impact to us on a long-term basis, making sure you have funding available to you. And so that's the question. If you're saying I need these projects and I need them now, and I don't want to raise my rates any higher, and I'm only going to draw down my cash, let's say by a portion of it, then the only other option for you is to debt finance. And so again, I want to make sure I understand where we're going with the capital projects, so that I can make sure that's there. Because in this year, like I said, we could certainly do that. But that said, we have about 80 million in reserves. So if we draw down 24, you're taking about a third away in 1 year. And what does that look like? And again, we have a chart coming up in a few slides to show you, if all you did was say, I'm going just to use reserves to pay for these projects because these projects are important to me, then we're in a position to say, we're going to be out of cash in a few years. And I'm not sure that's the direction that we need to go, but that's the contemplation that we have in front of us.
I'm not quite sure spending $24 million means we're going to be out of cash in a few years, but okay.
Well, and let me make my assumption there, meaning that if all I said is I don't want to debt finance and I'm not raising my rates higher than a certain portion there, and all I'm going to do is draw on my reserves to make these capital projects happen, you will be out of cash in a few years. Again, I'm not saying that's what we're going to do. I'm just saying that is one way to handle it, but I'm not certain that's the direction that we would go. I'm just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that.
And the other way to handle it is to draw down your reserves for a period where your reserves are still more than adequate, and then figure out how you're going to move forward. So doesn't mean that you're going to continue that in that direction.
Correct. I mean, it can be a combination. I agree. It could be an absolute combination of all those items there. But again, the importance is identifying what those projects are, identifying the timing of those projects, and then we collectively can then work together as a staff and board, working together to make sure that we're delivering that water and making sure we're investing in our capital in appropriate ways, so that we can make sure that we are fiscally stable during this period of time.
I would, at least for my ease of understanding and following things, it would be easier if you could, next time you bring this table to us, split that first line so that we show what the CIP funded portion is. So that line would be, instead of reading 8.2 million for 22-23, it would be 4 million for CIP or Pago funded, and 14 million for reserves. So then we know that if we're proceeding, we're really going to be drawing down reserves for $14 million.
Right.
So when we talk about the overall project, because it gets confusing. If I look at Pago reserves, I have no idea what that ratio is. Is it 50-50? Is it 25-75? Is it 75-25? I have
Sure.
no idea. And it'd be just as easy to split that into two lines. They are different items. One is CIP or net revenues that's left over for CIP, and the other one is reserves that you would be drawing down from.
Sure.
So,
And absolutely. Sure, I can certainly provide that there. I do want to also share with you, though, the $11 million that you see there. I have not shown that we're using commercial paper. I know that there is concern for us to use our commercial paper right now as we, understand sort of, where we're going as a district and all that stuff. So we would still need to figure out paying for that $11 million. And if it does, it will, have a slight uptick, if you will, in that commercial paper line. utilizing our commercial paper line. But for the purposes of this discussion, I have not shown that yet, just because, again, I know I've been asked to sort of pause on using our commercial paper while the board goes through this review.
So thank you for talking about that. That's the next line I was going to go and try to clarify. So when we said debt financing, and we're talking about commercial paper, a commercial line is basically a 2-year line. So after 2 years, you either refinance your commercial paper line, or you're going to refinance it as long-term debt. Is that correct or not?
Correct. We can absolutely look to, yes, there's a couple ways to handle that. And I see my my financial advisors on board too, so I can have Darren also answer this question for me. But we can use, our reserves, if you will, to pay back that. So if we do not continue on with the commercial paper, you can use now your reserves to pay that that dollar back. Or yes, you would have to then, if we are not going to continue on with the commercial paper, you would then have to convert it to long-term debt. Anything more, Darren, to add, or did I cover it?
You're absolutely correct, Margaret. If we have any draws under the commercial paper facility, it has to be paid off one way or the other, either with contributions from the district or long-term debt financing. However, I will say if there's no draws under it, then, it can be allowed to expire at that point.
Thank you for the clarification. Okay, so as we move forward in the future, when we talk about debt financing, and if we're going to do commercial paper, maybe we ought to, so that everybody's cognizant, because I'm very aware, I am very aware of the fact that when I'm told it's commercial paper, I go, okay, so in 2 years, we're either going to have to take money out of reserves, or we're going to long-term debt finance it, which is what the district has done in the past. In either case, people should be aware of that, and that commercial paper isn't some ephemeral financing that just takes care of everything, because it doesn't just take care of everything. It's a short-term way of getting cash so that you don't have to do long-term debt issuance on a more frequent basis. Okay, go ahead. Those are my comments on that, and I would appreciate, at least for me, that table being further clarified along those lines for our next go around.
Will do, absolutely. All right, so over to the next section, which just talks about our current capital investment. And I wanted just to give you sort of a little look back, because certainly incorporated within our fiscal year 22-23 is, some costs associated with that, or revenues, if you will, associated with that past investment that we've made. So let's turn to page 25 of your packet, and we'll talk about our capital investment. So I've updated the schedules through on a fiscal year basis. So this as of June 30th, 2021. You can see that we've invested about $765 million in projects there. And you can see sort of where we've done that with land, with our different refineries, with our main treatment facility over at the Edward C. Little Water Reclamation Plant. So all told, you see that we have an investment of about $765 million. And so the question is, if we turn to page 26, well, how did I pay for that? How did I pay for that amount? So if we can go to page 26, please.
Okay, before we do that, just one question in terms of the breakdown or the total value of the fixed assets. Is that the value in terms of dollars? Is that the value that actually was paid for? Or is that the depreciated value or the book value as of today? What is that? What is that number?
As it's indicated, this is our investment. So this is the historic cost of what we paid for those things. It's not net of depreciation. This is the amount that we invested into our facilities.
Okay, so that would be in dollars of whatever it was invested. Should be
correct. So $1995 or $2003 or $2014. Yes, absolutely. That's whatever we paid for that particular facility. That is what it was paid, what it was cost and what we show on our books, historic
That's
costs.
that's what I thought, and I just wanted to confirm that. Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, so now let's please go to page 26. So again, this year is to provide you a breakdown. Well, how did we pay for that $765 million there? And I wanted just to share with you, you can see about 60% of that was funded with debt proceeds. So we'll have a slide later on to show you sort of that history of our debt proceeds over that period of time. But again, we still have some debt outstanding. As you saw, heard me say earlier, $21 million is being paid currently. It does drop down over the period of time. And I think our last debt goes out until 2041. But you can see we have about 60% of our budget coming from that. We have about $117 million from grants and actually say other sources of revenues. And I have a breakdown on the following slide so you can see where that money came from. And then the balance is coming from the district. So you can see there that that district represents that gray wedge of about 26%. So of our 765 million, we've been very blessed with 15% in grants and other revenues, 26% coming from the district. And how do we pay for that is through our rates and charges, if you will. And then you've got your debt service there of about, or debt proceeds, I should say, of about 60%. Going to page 27, it gives you a bit more breakdown. Again, where did I get that grants money? So you can see there, we're very, very fortunate to receive about 50 million or so from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, another $35 million from the Army Corps of Engineers. And then we had about $10 million coming through from the Department of Water Resources. This is past grants and monies that we received. It does not take into consideration those future grants and other revenues that we're expecting from customers for our future projects, but these are what are currently on hand, if you will. We also had funding from some of our customers, if you will. LADWP paid for a pipeline. That was over a 25-year period of time. We received about $5 million from them. NRG, we did a project for them. They paid us all up front for that. And so that you can see about $8.3 million received there. And then in the other category, about $9 million coming from three significant things. We did a project where Southern California Edison actually came through and gave us about $2.6 million. Marathon came in and paid about $1.9 million as it relates to our project over there with our Carson Regional Facility. And then the SoFi Stadium, we were donated an asset there. And that came in at about $3.3 million there. So all told, you can see we were been, getting monies from a variety of sources of about $118 million. So we go to page 28. I mentioned to you that, of that investment that we had with our capital, we had about $450 million that came, through debt proceeds. And so the question is now, well, how did I pay for those debt proceeds? So again, we've been very fortunate through the years to be able to get funding from a number of sources here. One of them is those fixed payments, those capital fixed payments that we receive from the refineries for the work that is done on their sites. And you can see that it's about $162 million. From our standby charge collections, you can see it's about $284 million. And the local resources program, it shows about $4.6 million. And I would just clarify that we've actually received more in LRP funding. We've actually, as the note says there, about $172 million. But in order just to show sort of how did we pay for the net proceeds, you can see there that I show just a balancing number there. But really the LRP, not only did it pay for principal, but it also helped us pay for the interest towards that. So we did have about I'll say about $300 million in interest payments over this period of time from 1991 through to 2021. So on page 29, I just wanted to share you a little bit of our history of our debt. Back in 1991, we issued our first debt, and that was for our phase one of our facility that we now known as ECL Water Reclamation Facility. So $115 million was our first debt issuance. And then over the years, we've had other different issuances as we've done different phases. So phase 2, 3, 4, all the way up through phase 5 in 2012. So you can see that, our numbers have kind of hit to sort of that peak level in 2012. Since that time, we've actually only had debt proceeds of about $25 million from 2012 to now. Otherwise, we've been very diligent about paying off our debt service, and today it's about $196 million. So on page 30 here, this is again sort of that what if scenario. I'm not saying that this is what the district would do, but again, if the district said, I need these projects now, and I'm only comfortable raising rates at a certain point, what would that look like if I had to, the only other place for me to draw, if I'm not going to go issue debt, is to draw from your reserves. And you can see that red line is sort of based off of our designated funds policy, our reserve policy. There's a calculation that helps to determine what that is, and it tells you where it is. So today we're slightly above what that number is. But if you see that if we did nothing but says, I'm only going to pull in $5 million or $4 million, depending upon what scenario you'd use, from your Pago funding, your net revenues, and I'm going to draw the rest from reserves, you can see that in year 23, you get down to that minimum reserve. Then if you continue to use that sort of as a ways to do that, you start to draw your reserves down below your minimum. And in fact, actually in a few years, again, assuming you do all these projects, and these projects move forward as stipulated, you will be out of cash in a few years. Now, that is just to give you the high level view. Again, I know that that's not going to be our approach, but that is something that, as we as staff is looking at these numbers, again, understanding what that 1 year impact is helpful, but you can see that it's going to be very helpful for us to, on the out years, to say, how are we going to make sure that we are positioning ourselves to be in a good position going forward? So is it that means that I can't necessarily draw on cash, I'm going to have to issue debt, or I'm going to have to raise rates? Those are all the questions that we would love to have a conversation with you to make sure that as we go forward, we can do a good job on making sure that we are managing our portfolio, managing our rate increases, and still being able to deliver on our mission statement. So that takes the end of my prepared comments before I turn it over to PFM to share a little bit more about our credit rating considerations. Again, I think that sort of that context or that lens is very important for you. And it gives you an opportunity to see what the rating agencies are looking at our peer agencies and then what they have for their consideration. And with that, I turn it over to Darren Hodge with PFM to take the next few slides.
Thank you, Margaret. Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So if we can turn to slide 32, please. I want to start on 32 with talking a little bit at a 30,000-foot view of credit ratings. So what are credit ratings and why are they important? So credit ratings are essentially a third party's opinion of the likelihood of timely repayment of debt service on the bonds that we've issued. Now, why do credit ratings play an important role? Because essentially credit ratings are what investors use to help determine what interest rate we can borrow at when we go sell publicly issued debt. Now, in coming up with a credit rating, how are they determined? Well, they're determined by a number of economic, operational, and financial components. And one important thing to keep in mind is that it's kind of each individual component of the credit combines to overall give us our overall credit quality and overall credit rating. And so what I mean by that is there's no single component in and of itself that will determine our rating. And we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but let's just take an example. Days cash on hand. For each one of these components, such as days cash on hand, there's a spectrum of how strong is our days cash on hand currently. It'll range from extremely strong to poor. And if our days cash is on the extremely strong, in and of itself, that does not mean we'll be a AAA rated entity. It combines into the overall credit package with the other factors to determine our credit rating. The other element that the credit rating agencies use is not only their own criteria, they also compare us to our peers. And so later in the presentation, Luis, my colleague, will talk about how we stack up versus some of our peers with regards to several key credit components. So in general, when we look at the two agencies that rate us, what are the criteria that they use? Well, there's a couple different criteria that they look at. The first is service area economics. So that's the size, wealth, and population growth of our service area. Second is industry risk and market position. That really gets to competition, affordability, and rate flexibility. Next, we get into some of our metrics, which is debt service coverage, as well as liquidity. And then lastly, we talk about management and governance. So these are the 5 elements of a rating that they look at and then combine to get the overall credit package. Move to the next slide, please, slide 33. Now, obviously, within those criteria that I went through, there's certain components that we simply don't have control over. The first is our service area fundamentals. So, us being a large coastal service area, that's a credit positive for the most part from the rating agencies. But one item when they look at our service area fundamentals that S&P in particular is sensitive to is the concentration of our top customers. And really the fact that when you look at the concentration of some of our top non-municipal customers, the ratings on those might be a little lower than perhaps our municipal customers. And so that plays into their overall credit rating when they speak with us. And obviously the second thing that we don't have a lot of control over is just hydrological conditions in general. So that being said, there are elements within our credit criteria that we do have control over, some of which Margaret's talked about today, primarily debt service coverage and our liquidity position. So why don't we turn to the next slide, slide 34. So in addition to rating agency considerations, as Margaret's talked about, there's also legal considerations that we have when we talk about planning and budget. And one of the first that we think about is our rate covenant. So anytime we issue publicly, anytime we sell public debt, we enter into what's called a rate covenant. It's a legal covenant with investors of our bonds that we will set our rates in a manner that during each fiscal year, net revenues are at least 115% of our debt service for that fiscal year. Now, as we'll talk about in a little while, that's the minimum. Obviously, if you get down to that level, you will have certain credit considerations because down to that level, the rating agencies will become concerned. And so there would be downward pressure on our ratings as we near that. So getting to that point, why don't we turn to slide 35? So on 35, as I mentioned, debt service coverage is a very important component of our overall rating. While our rate covenant is 115, that's the minimum that we legally have to set our rates at to get net revenues. That's not from a purely financial standpoint, kind of what's ideal. And in the past, West Basin set a target of a debt service coverage for 1.75 times. And why was that target set? Well, when we looked at it, several components came to mind. The first is that from our perspective, purely from a financial perspective, it's prudent from a financial planning aspect because it does provide a buffer for unanticipated impacts to revenues or expenses. So drought conditions, loss of a revenue stream, et cetera. And because of that buffer, that 175 supports strong ratings, and that's noted by the agencies in their analyses. The other item is that a strong debt service coverage, in addition to a rate covenant, we also have an additional bonds test. So as we look at over the years on our capital plan, if we need to issue debt, we do have to meet certain coverage targets in order to issue new bonds. And so a 175 level gives us plenty of cushion to be able to issue bonds. Obviously, once we got down closer to that 115 coverage target, that would be a little more challenging to issue debt at that point. Now, just from an actual number standpoint, last fiscal year, fiscal 21, debt service coverage was about 1.84 times. And when we look at fiscal year 22, what we're currently expecting is about 1.7. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on how the agencies look at us and how they calculate coverage. So I want to point out one specific nuance here. The rating agencies that rate us, S&P and Moody's, they calculate debt service coverage slightly different. And so when we look on the following slides at where we fit in within their criteria and their credit spectrum, you'll see different numbers. So I want to spend a little time talking about that to avoid any confusion. So what I've done here on this table at the very bottom is I've broken out fiscal 21 and fiscal 22 coverage, how we, West Basin, calculate it, how S&P calculates it, and how Moody's calculates it. So as Margaret mentioned, West Basin calculated coverage, which is essentially net revenues divided by debt service, is 1.84 times in fiscal 21 and 1.7 in fiscal 22. Now, S&P takes into account.
Darren, we need to interrupt you. You're breaking up.
Darren, can you hear us?
Falling apart.
Yes, sorry, was I cutting out?
Yes.
Yes.
If you can start
Okay.
back to the S&P, how they look at it.
Okay, perfect. So S&P takes a little bit different approach to their calculation, what they call all-in coverage. And what they will include within their coverage is about 30% of our water purchase cost. They will treat that as an obligation. And so as you look at this table, you'll note that S&P's all-in coverage is slightly lower than our calculated coverage. And that's the reason behind that, because when they look at our water purchase cost, they look at it as a portion of that cost that we're being charged is related to debt that the wholesaler has issued, and they pass through that cost to us. And so they try to take that cost into account within their criteria. Now, moving on to Moody's. Moody's also takes a slightly different approach. They don't include certain of the capital revenues that we include in our coverage. And so again, you'll note that their coverage differs slightly from ours, but unlike S&P, they don't include a factor of water purchase cost in their calculation. So it's a little bit higher than what S&P calculates. I'll pause there and make sure there's no questions, because those are going to be important components as we talk through the next several slides. Perfect. Okay, let's turn to slide 36, please. So a lot of numbers on this slide, but I'm going to break it down for us, and we'll walk through it. So within the criteria for debt service coverage and liquidity, both Moody's and S&P have a criteria and a spectrum of where we fall within their criteria for each of these rating components. Up on the top, we have Moody's utility scorecard. On the bottom, we have S&P. So let's start with Moody's. So what the rating agencies do is they'll calculate coverage and liquidity, and then they'll see where we fit within their overall criteria. And as you can see, kind of going back to the prior slide, if you remember, Moody's and, sorry, did someone have a question? No, okay. So in fiscal 21, Moody's calculated our coverage at about 1.6 times. And so what we've done is we've shaded here in gray where we fall within Moody's credit scorecard. So we're at about that single A level. From a liquidity standpoint, if you remember, our liquidity on a day's cash on hand falls within that AA category level. And then lastly, they look at overall leverage, debt to operating revenues. And given our debt to operating revenues is fairly low, we're in that AAA category. So let's kind of go back to what I said at the very beginning, which is our rating in and of itself is a agglomeration of all of these different criteria. So this is really an example of this, because within the three components that they measure for liquidity and coverage, we rate in three different categories: single A, double A, and triple A. And when they combine these three within all the other factors, our economics, demographics, management, etc., we end up at that AA2 level. And so that's very important when talking about our debt service, our credit rating. So the other component to look at here is that as Margaret looks at what our debt service coverage might be going forward, if we do expect to see debt service coverage lowering, you can see how that might impact overall credit score, because if you look right to the right of our single A where we currently are, if we drop below 125, that is where we enter the next lowest credit score for debt service coverage, which would then put downward pressure on our rating. Now let's move to S&P's profile. So very similar to what we did with Moody's, what we did with S&P is we took a look at what fiscal 21 debt service coverage and liquidity would look like under S&P's scorecard. And so if you remember on the prior slide, S&P for fiscal 21, their all-in coverage was about 1.35 times. So we fit right within that strong level, which you can consider a single A within that credit criteria. But within their liquidity and reserve category, we score at the top end of that spectrum based off their criteria, maintaining liquidity above 150 days cash on hand, as well as an aggregate more than 75 million. Again, one thing I want to look at is that as Margaret was talking about the potential impact on debt service coverage in fiscal 23 and on, what we did is we did some kind of back of the envelope calculations. And then if debt service coverage falls to about that 1.2 times level in fiscal 23, when we look at S&P's scorecard, that would potentially put us in this vulnerable range where S&P's calculated coverage would be between 1 and 1.10 times. And so there could be some potential impacts to our credit rating based off what the debt service coverage numbers would look like. And then if we go out further over the next 5 years, as you can see, if we were to draw down our reserves and we fall to these lower categories, that would have potential negative ramifications for our credit rating. And so I want to just pause there and make sure that there's no question, because that's a very important component, at least from a financial perspective, as we look at the actions over the next 5 years, is what might be the impacts of the ratings of lower coverage or lower liquidity. Okay, perfect. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Louise Horton, who's going to pick up on slide 37.
Thanks, Darren. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So on the prior slide, we were talking about how West Basin's liquidity and coverage metrics fall within the rating criteria. And on this slide, we're taking a closer look at what both Moody's and S&P have said about the district's liquidity and coverage. So with regard to liquidity, both rating agencies have a fairly positive view of West Basin's current liquidity levels, but both of them noted that should the district experience significant reductions in reserves and liquidity, that could lead to a rating downgrade. Regarding coverage, both agencies are also pretty comfortable with West Basin's coverage levels, although Moody's did note that West Basin's coverage is below the AA national median, which we'll get into in the table at the bottom. And then similar to the comment for liquidity, both Moody's and S&P noted that should the district experience a significant or sustained reduction in coverage, that could put the rating under pressure. And so below we have, we've included the national medians for both water agencies that are rated by S&P and Moody's. So the section that's in the darker blue towards the top, those are the medians for days cash on hand. And then in the lighter blue, we have the medians for debt service coverage based off of the coverage calculations that each respective agency would make. I think an important consideration with this table, there are two important considerations. One, what Darren's already noted about how the rating agencies take into account a lot of different factors when evaluating the district's credit. And number two, these medians incorporate both wholesale and retail water agencies. However, looking at these medians, we do see what Moody's noted, that West Basin does fall below the medians for the AA category. And that's just helpful context for the rating agency's comments that should liquidity or coverage metrics get weaker and weaker, that's going to put downward pressure on the rating. So with that, let's flip to package page 38.
And Louise, while you're turning to package page 38, I just want to acknowledge that we have our Director Gray, who has joined the call. So I just want to acknowledge Director Gray as being present.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Louise.
Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you,
Yes,
Director
Director
Gray.
Gray.
Can you hear me? Thank you. I am here. Thank you.
Thank you. So on this slide, package page 38, we take a look at other water agencies that are considered the district's peers. This is valuable compared to the national medians because water agencies do operate a little differently across the country, and there are certain issues that water agencies in California face that are unique to California. So the agencies that are shown here are some of the peers that were identified by the district's rating analysts who rate the agency. So we're including these metrics because, as Darren sort of previewed, while the rating agencies do evaluate the district's metrics within context of the criteria, The district is also compared against what are considered its peer utilities. So this is just helpful to see. First on the top, we have days cash metrics. I would note that for Eastern, the Fitch rating has been upgraded to AAA. And then in the table below, we are comparing debt service coverage metrics. These are just the debt service coverage metrics based off of the most recent annual report, not specific to either S&P or Moody's coverage calculation. And then with that, sorry, was there a question?
I do have a question. Just out of curiosity, who makes the determination that these agencies are the peer agencies?
So
as
we reached
opposed to
out.
Other agencies.
Sorry, Darren, did you want to take that?
No,
I'm
go
just saying,
ahead.
who makes the determination? Who picked Cayega, Santa Clara Valley, Santa Clarita Valley, Eastern, and Western?
Yeah, so we reached out directly to the rating analysts. There are a few rating analysts who cover West Basin consistently, and so we reached out to those analysts and said, sort of based off of your assessment, this is their independent assessment. They're who get pulled in to rate the district. Who do they consider to be peer agencies? So we're discussing the district's ratings, and we're talking to the people who would directly be comparing West Basin to these agencies to evaluate the district's credit.
And maybe you don't have the answer, but could you get back to me as to what is the criteria that they use to pick these agencies as opposed to any other agency? Because some of these agencies are retail agencies and some are not. We're not a retail agency. So if I look at it from that consistency point of view, I go, well, I'm not quite sure why they would be our peers if they're retailers and we're not a retailer. So there's got to be, and personally, I think there's a very much of an arbitrary assumption being made in the selection of these agencies. But if there is objective as opposed to subjective criteria, I would like to know what that objective criteria consists of.
And so, Director, that's an excellent question, an excellent point. There is no criteria to identify peers. It is very much subject to the discretion of the rating analyst. And so we have had discussion with them in the past, kind of pointing out we are unique. And so saying that our peers are more retail-oriented agencies, that is not necessarily appropriate. And they've acknowledged that. And so what I think the other important point to put in here is that they recognize that retail agencies are going to have different characteristics, operational, financial, et cetera. So they do take that into account when they're looking at the rating. So it's not as if a pure retail agency with 800 days cash on hand is going to be looked at as 100% similar to us. So you've hit on a very important ongoing discussion that we have with the agencies. Who should our peers be? And to be quite honest, they have some trouble in terms of finding direct comps.
We have no peers.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, Director?
Yes, a very subjective criteria.
Mr. President, this is Director Houston. I actually want to ask a question.
Go ahead, Director Houston.
Thank you. So actually, Director Alvarez beat me to the punch because I was looking at this too, and I was really confused as to how these folks compare to us, which I don't think any of them practically compare to us. And thank you for your answer, Darren. I think, well, first of all, why isn't that, we also, you guys or whomever, can't look at some of the other ones that we might consider peers, or you help determine our peers and give us those numbers too, because unfortunately this, these just don't compare to me. And I'm not the expert on that, but I'm just saying, like, off the top of my head, I don't know, how many connections does Cayugas have? What do they do relative to us? How many assets do they have? You know, same with Santa Clara Valley Water District, you know, way up north. You know, they're not even buying Met Water. So I don't know what, you know, off the top of my head, their assets are, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I see these things and I'm just thinking, number one, these people just really don't compare to us. But then I see, wow, they have a lot of cash on hand. You know, I don't even know off the top of my head what projects they've got in the pipeline. So this is really hard for me to digest. If I'm going to make comparisons, like, does this make us look really good to people or really bad to people, right? I mean, just on a very basic term. So I think if you all would come back at some point and showcase some agencies on our own, regardless of what these other experts think, that would be good for comparison, because this paint's not really the best picture in some ways, if I'm reading it properly, you know.
Well, and I think the other important point, the first answer is, yeah, absolutely. Happy to get back to you with that information. I think the other important point is that when we're showing this days cash versus coverage, we're not saying anyone's any better or worse, because to your point, they might have different, I call it a business plan, but kind of a different business approach, right? They may be at a different stage of their CIP cycle. From a kind of a board directive standpoint, they just may operate differently. And to be quite honest, to the other point is that they may only have a component being wholesale, and they might be primarily retail, which typically requires or benefits from higher coverage, higher liquidity levels. And so I want to make that clear. We're not saying that this comparison right here is any better or any worse. We're just trying to be transparent in terms of here's how the rating agencies rate us, so that there's an understanding with y'all of when we talk to the rating agencies, they might say, okay, you fit within this credit criteria, which we talked about. Well, I fit within a AAA with days cash on hand. Why are you telling me that I don't stack up well versus my peers? And so it's like, well, there's this other subjective component to the ratings that we just wanted to highlight and make sure that you are all aware.
No, thank you, Darren. And I think that's a good explanation. Obviously, this is what the rating agencies are utilizing. So I think what would probably also be helpful is to say, yes, here's what they're saying. But then we also have another slide that says, okay, now here's some other examples that actually hone a little closer to you all. Because, you know, obviously, I think it's probably a lot easier, let's say cities, they might be able to compare themselves to each other, right? A whole bunch of cities across the board, they do similar things. You know, some may contract out services, some may not, but that's a lot easier to compare. But yes, the water districts are very difficult, right? Because some are retail, some are wholesale, some are both, and size and assets and what are they doing? And then we happened also, a big chunk of our sales literally is just pass through. So anyway, I think that would be really, really good for us to see, because again, what I'm just saying is if I was the average person off the street and I saw this, I might be like, uh-oh, what's going on at West Basin? You know what I mean? It just is appearance. Now, let me ask one other question real fast. On the prior page, page 37, you know, for both of you, and it was just, I mean, I noticed the comments that were made of these, of Moody's and S&P. And I guess, could you guys give us a little more insight on these comments? Because here's what I thought. What are we to make of the comments, right? When they say liquidity is healthy, but sizable declines in liquidity could lead to a downgrade. You know, the coverage is strong, but a potential negative rating action if coverage ratios are put under pressure. So, I mean, obviously these folks are looking at us and saying, okay, if there's some changes here that go in a negative direction, that's not going to be good for our credit rating, obviously. But again, I mean, we're looking at you all for expertise here, but what are we to make of these comments? And then again, going back to just this other chart we just saw, that, you know, these other agencies have a lot more cash on hand, et cetera, et cetera. So what's this picture that we're being painted here, you know, so we can think about the future of debt coverage at the agency?
Yeah, you're asking us to decode the rating agency EASE as they speak, and they speak in very vague terms often. And it's intentional on their part, because if you remember when I talked earlier about there's no single component in of itself that determines our rating, it's the entire package. So they try to speak a little bit vague when they talk about liquidity and coverage, because we could have a substantial decrease in coverage, but a substantial increase in liquidity that might offset each other. But to answer your question, what they're saying here is they're basically giving you insight into here's how we currently view your certain of your metrics, in this case, liquidity and debt service coverage, and here's what potentially might change our view and lead to a downgrade. And just to be clear, they say this for virtually all agencies. So within most credit reports, they'll have a section that says, here's how we rate you, here's what could lead to an upgrade, here's what could lead to a downgrade. So this isn't necessarily specific to you. We just pulled this so that you could have some information specific to you. So to answer the question of, interpret this for me, what does this mean? Let's actually turn to the prior slide, slide 36. So let's just look at S&P real quick. So what S&P says currently is they say, right now coverage is strong, averaging 1.83 times over the past 3 years, which is 1.2 to 1.4 on an all-in basis, which is how they rate in what we're showing in this profile right here. What they say going forward is that potential negative rating action could occur if coverage ratios are put under pressure. What that means is that right now we are in that strong category for coverage, so about 1.2 to 1.4. If we fall to an adequate or to a vulnerable area, that is potential cause for concern, which could have potential negative rating implications for us. Now, I'm going to start speculating, but this is based off my experience and what we see, is that in these situations, if we fall to an all-in coverage between 1 and 1.1, obviously the rating agencies are going to be concerned. They'll have questions. But what they're going to be also interested in is this a one-time event? What does it look like when you extrapolate out the next several years? Because they recognize we're in the middle of a drought. They recognize that things happen on a, just kind of year to year. But they want to look and see what's your plan to increase coverage in the future. And so they do take that into account. But to answer your specific question, Director, that's what they're kind of telling you here, which is right now you're strong, but if your all-in coverage falls below 1.2 and you get down into that adequate or vulnerable category, that's going to have potential negative actions for your rating. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. And I want to thank you, Darren, for indulging that. And I think I have just one last question, and this is, this is the longer term thinking. I think, some of my colleagues are probably in this too, because we've set that target, we've been trying to achieve it. But, we also see that, look, in the future, we're going to need to make some significant investments at the district. We want to focus on a certain amount of Pago. We need to manage the revenues coming in. Probably going to down the road have less water sales, obviously, and imported, hopefully maybe somehow more recycled. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to finance or, somehow pay for different various projects. And I'm not talking about just the purple pipe or something. I'm talking about, at the plant, the facility, the different facilities. So I guess really long story short in this is, what do you all think is maybe the best way to go? I mean, this is a very open-ended question, putting you on the spot, but, let's just think about it. We're going to try and, if we're looking at the 5 years out or such, we are going to have to finance a certain amount of things. But at the same time, we want to have that healthy balance of having enough revenue to come in and have enough cash on hand and not terribly impact the credit rating. But also knowing, like you just said, you may have a dip. So can you just, I don't even know how you answer this question, but give me this kind of like that 30,000 foot, what are we supposed to do? What is the best balance? Because people have different mindsets on this.
No, absolutely. And it's a very important question. And part of our job is not to necessarily tell you what to do, but give you information to help you make the decision in terms of the direction. So this is just one aspect, right? We're just looking at ratings. What do ratings affect? Well, they affect the cost at which we borrow. And so we do have a slide, which I want to get to in just a second, which says, okay, well, if moving forward, if the district decides that, we want to spend down reserves or we want to let debt service coverage fall, what does that mean in terms of our future debt service costs? Because I think that's the longer term impact. Now, in terms of kind of where should you be? Again, I can't necessarily tell you that, but what I can tell you is if we go, let's see, we're on slide 36, perfect. This is kind of giving us the roadmap, right? So when we talk about what our debt service coverage target, where do we not want to fall below? Where do we want to stay in liquidity? This gives us a pretty good framework to say, okay, if we like being AA2, AA minus, which I think is a very strong rating, gives us a lot of flexibility, allows us to borrow at attractive costs, then here are the parameters that we need to try and stay within. Assuming, obviously taking off the account the peer analysis, but in general, this is where we want to remain. And will we have years where we fall below or go above these levels? Absolutely. But within the 5-year plan, if we want to stay at the current rating categories, here's where we want to at least try and remain. Now, to get to the longer term aspect, Luis, why don't we turn to slide 39? And Luis ran out some numbers to see currently in today's market, if we were to borrow at our current rates, what would that mean in terms of a hypothetical debt issuance? And then on the alternative, if we start to run a little leaner, if we get downgraded, what does that mean? And I think, Director, that'll give you some context behind what is at least the financial cost from a debt perspective to these different rating categories.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so just to briefly summarize this slide before we kind of get into the numbers on the left-hand side. On the right, we have a graph that is just showing current rates associated with AAA, AA, and single A ratings. So we've got AAA in blue, AA in orange, and single A in gray. Sorry, was there a question? Okay. And so just generally what this graph is showing is that as the ratings become lower, rates associated with those ratings will become a little bit higher. And so then in the table on the left, we essentially try to put some numbers to what that rate increase would look like. On the top, we are showing what that cost differential would look like at current rates. So the borrowing cost for a single A rated bond versus a AA rated bond would be about 0.1%, which for a 30-year bond, we ran out for a hypothetical $90 million issuance. For that bond, it would be about a little over $2 million in additional total debt service. And then to provide sort of a broader picture, we also took a look at what that would look like at historical averages since 2000. So if we compare the historical AA rating versus the historical average single A rating, then that cost differential is about twice what we're seeing at current rates.
And if I could just add in here on the particular thing is, regardless of the projects that we're identifying in the 5-year project, are we going to debt finance them, Pago them? Again, it's the long-term consideration that's here. So again, if we are moving forward in a new direction and we want to be able to, work with our regional partners that are there, and there's a project that's out there, and again, let's just assume it's $90 million. Again, the decisions that we start making today and how that impacts us in the next few years before that project's in place is a very important one. Because again, we might find ourselves where we are no longer in a position to be AA and will be single A, and we may be comfortable there, but that is a board decision. But knowing that, you just know that it's going to cost you more perhaps in the future associated. Again, this is assuming off of today's dollars, but all of that is the context that we wanted to provide you today. Because again, how we start to address that CIP budget and how we start to address our rate management strategy and where we go forward is an important one. And so, again, the decisions about fiscal year 22-23, we can make certain decisions about how it is. But if we say, you know what, I cannot, I want these projects, but I don't want a higher rate increase, and I don't want to draw on reserves, I got to issue debt, because I want to stay in a AA category. Or, you say, oh, I'm going to do a little bit of combination. And so again, we just see this as the beginning of the conversation as, again, the board contemplates sort of where they move forward with it. So again, providing you that lens, that broader lens that, we on the finance side are looking at that to address the questions that are out there.
Well, this is Board Member Houston. I'll just to end my portion, and I appreciate all of the explanations, because what I want to make sure of is when we talk about this, it's probably going to apply more to the next budget cycle than this one in my mind to a degree, but what we do look at as that healthy number. Are we going to stay at that 1.75 target? Are we going to adjust that? What will the board, as you said, be comfortable with? You know, are we striving to be the AAA or AA? You know, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to having a better understanding of that. But I think that, you know, we definitely need to look at, you know, apples and apples on that, so we understand how we compare to others. But at the end of the day, we have to do what's right for the district, you know, and we can't concern ourselves with what everybody else is doing per se, as long as we look healthy, you know, to the those that we're borrowing funds from. So anyway, thank you very much for these explanations. I do appreciate that. Thank you.
So that does take it to the end of PFM's prepared comments. Again, if you have any questions, additional questions for them, more than happy for you to ask them here. I do have one follow-up slide, and maybe I can just take that last slide, and then we can answer any questions to the board. So I'll leave it to board members to see if they have any more questions to PFM, or if I should address the last slide.
Address the last slide, please.
Okay, then let's please go to page 41 of the packet, please. So you've heard a lot today, and again, this is really just to, you know, to say that we are here to work with you to navigate through this time where, you know, yes, there's pressure on our rates. Yes, we understand there's a drought condition. We have a capital investment program that we want to make sure that we have, you know, that integrity within our system. We have future plans, all of that we understand. And we want to work with you with that. And so we've identified a few future considerations that as we go through this process, you know, making sure that finance is involved in that conversation with you so that we can help, you know, shape the conversation there. So I've outlined 4 particular items that are there. One is to develop a capital funding policy. Again, as I mentioned to you, I, you know, took that sort of the net number, if you will, that's not being funded by external sources or debt proceeds or whatever, and saying what's left for the district to fund. You saw that number there, $29 million in fiscal year 22-23, $120 million over a 5-year period of time. What is our strategy there? We have an internal process that we work through and how I identify it there. But as we go forward, how do we want to approach it? Are we going to issue debt? And where are we going to issue debt? Where are we going to use PAGO funding? Where do we want to draw on reserves where it's appropriate? Do we want to start setting aside money for things that we know that are coming up in the future? And that is definitely a sort of, I'll say, a change from where we've been. We've always been in sort of an expansion mode, but now we find ourselves, at least with the CIP budget that's in front of you today, and a very much 78% or something like that is, you know, for R&R projects. So again, want to work with you to understand how we can structure this so that we can really get to an end result there. 2 is, of course, we want to make sure we identify those future funding sources for customer projects. As I mentioned, we're letting the ones that we have those signed agreements with, you know, run out. But we know that we have future projects where we have our customers that will be a part of it, and working with them to negotiate on those particular contracts and say, hey, come in and help us pay for this project that's for you and for what your water needs are. And so understanding that can certainly have a positive impact to us. But again, we need to understand where those projects are and where we're moving forward with it so that we can start to envelop that into our assumptions. Number 3 is, where applicable, pursue federal and state grants. I know we already do a great job with it. You saw our past history on that there. And we know that as we look at the projects that we have today, are the projects that we have, you know, the R&R projects, are they eligible or not? You know, where can we really seek that funding there? If that's another place for us to draw on funds, or is it another, you know, state loan that's there? You know, yes, it's a debt commitment out there, but maybe it's at a lower rate than perhaps what you can see on the market. And finally, so I'll sort of conclude with just the conversation, and certainly Director Houston sort of brought up, which is, what is our for us to review and analyze our potential impacts on our current rating strategy. Do we want to stay on the current path that we have? We want to stay at a AA rated agency, and if so, what does that mean for us in determining what our rates are so we can get to those coverage requirements. What does it mean for us to keep certain sort of reserve levels around and see where we're at? So all of those are important conversations. So as you contemplate the conversation around your CIP projects and how that incorporates into our five-year plan and even longer, the finance is right there with you to have that conversation with you. And that takes us to the end of our prepared comments, and I will turn it back to our General Manager, Greg Reed, to see if he has any concluding remarks before we see if there's any additional questions.
Well, thank you, Margaret, for that excellent presentation. Certainly a continuing dialogue between our board and staff as to the future direction for our CIP, how we pivot the organization, and in particular our facilities towards a long-range regional approach towards water supply and sustainability, while at the same time making sure that we have the appropriate investments in our infrastructure to maintain the integrity that Margaret spoke about. I think I'd like to just maybe highlight one of the remarks that was made by our board of directors as far as the budget, does provide for kind of a framework for CIP projects. While some of those may not have been officially approved, we have kind of a framework within which we can fund various projects that may not be laid out in the CIP presentations that we've seen up until this point. So it gives us some flexibility to, provide for a decision towards a budget, a decision towards perhaps the scenario of a rate increase, while also maintaining some opportunity for us to revisit and refine our focus on our CIP program. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks there and hand it back to our board president, Director Deere.
Thank you. I want to thank Margaret, Darren, and Louise for a very informative presentation today. I've learned a lot. I'm working towards my associate degree in economics now compared to the level my colleagues are at. They're doing a lot better. But it was very, very informative. I appreciate it. Members of the board, any comments? Apparently not.
Director Williams here.
Director Williams, is that you?
Yes.
Go ahead.
And because we are a unique organization, I'm looking forward to really taking a deep dive into our CIP program, because it's plain to see that without recycled water, we might be similar to some organizations, but as long as our driving projects or what keeps us a unique organization is that we deliver recycled water, and the other water agency that are within our money spending level are not where we are. We have no projects that CIP projects that deliver potable water. The potable water that we supply comes from Metropolitan, and that's our contribution, or that's our delivery system. So our CIP projects are related to our recycled water program. And I think we really need to take a deep look at that, because without keeping that part of our business up, we're going to fail. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Good point. Any other comments?
Yeah, this is board members Houston. I want to
go ahead.
Thank you. I want to chime in really quick on this, because
My mother-in-law sent me.
Let's see here. I thought someone else was talking, but sorry. Let's see. Sorry, guys. I lost my thought, but let me find it. It was, oh, yes. I wanted to find out really fast while we're on the call. What is the next just so I know, Margaret, what is the timeline right now? Because I personally think we need some extra time here as we lead up to approving our budget wholly. But what is our timeline right now for budget workshops and some more decision making?
Certainly. So as far as I'll say prepared budget workshops, the initial plan was that this would be the last one for you just to sort of take it all in. We do have our customer agency workshop tomorrow at 10 a.m. So we do plan to share sort of the high level view of the previous presentations with our customers so that they are informed and engaged on what we do include in fiscal year 22-23. May was intended to just sort of, make sure that we received any additional input from you. We hope to have sort of a rough draft, if you will, of the budget document, knowing very well that there are some decisions that are still out there that are pending, but as other decisions are being made, we're been trying to update the numbers associated with it. And then the plan for us is to then bring back the budget as well as the water rate resolution to our June committee and board cycle. That committee's the board would be on June 27th. And so that's the ultimate decision. And I think as I heard our general manager mentioned is that, yes, there are some big decisions as it relates to our capital budget. But that being said, there are, I think, enough projects that we can identify from that, just from I'll say the ones that do sort of have green lighted as I think sort of in context, if you will, that we have, those dollars that are coming in could pay for, the net revenues that we get in, depending upon what scenario is selected. And so my hope is that we can still move forward with an adoption of fiscal year 22-23, while the dialogue still continues on with the capital budget and the long-term aspect of what that means.
Okay, perfect. So at least you mentioned where I was hoping we'd be at. So looking at trying to get this all wrapped up in June, but not in May. That's good. So we still have time for more workshops, information, et cetera, et cetera. So that alleviates a little bit my concern that it wouldn't be coming down the pike in May.
And I should clarify, it was my understanding at last week's workshop with the CIP budget that there was a follow-up request for some additional additional workshop with the board on the CIP budget. And so I think that they're going to be looking to you all board, your availability in, the mid-May timeframe to see about, connecting and having some more discussion on it. Again, these are big decisions, on the 5-year plan. Not all of it needs to be made for the adoption of the fiscal year 22-23, but we're very much aware that the fiscal year 2022-23, us having an understanding of where we're going with this CIP is a very important part for that budget. So it's, it's an important one, and I don't want to de-emphasize either one of them. It's just that we want to make sure that, the balance of the budget is, understood and appreciated and be able for us to move forward. But yes, no decision in May. Looking for a decision before the end of the fiscal year.
Okay, very good. There's a couple more things. I guess maybe I'll do my long-term stuff in the front, and then on the back end, I think I had a note here about the current budget. So I think one of the things I saw in the revenues that is concerning, because I mean, we can't 100%, of course, project what the world's going to do in 5 years, but we do have our assumptions in when it comes to the refineries that we serve. And of course, it's excellent that we get to provide them recycled water rather than potable as much as possible. But I think the question still is how much, those each of the refineries will be producing. I mean, is that, in time, a bit of a downtrend, if you will, maybe not quite as much volume. I don't think it's going to close anytime soon, but you know what I'm getting at. So I think that that's one of the things that for long-term planning, what type of water supply might we still be providing to our refiners in this service area, just with the nature of things in the world. And then the next thing is, I do think we've got to get a handle on what new projects we're pursuing. Especially, what is right now in the wheelhouse? Because I remember when I first got on the board, we were very focused on we need more purple pipes. We need to do more of these projects. We need to build up our customer outreach, work efforts, and we did. But now I think we're obviously pivoting. We're kind of in a different framework here. So one of the things I think would actually be really helpful, and I don't know if it's so much maybe on the budget thing, or maybe it's for our workshop down the road, Greg, or for, E&O, but is just to find out what is the current status of any new pursuits that staff might be working on, because we may want to make sure that we're not going after any projects that the board at this point may not want us to waste our time on, quite frankly. So I think we need to find out, I know we get our roster every month of what's going on, but I'm talking about potential new projects, because I don't want staff to be going out and trying to find things when that may or may not be something that we need to do or support. So I think that's something I'd like to see brought back to us in the near future. Two more things I have here. I think we need to make sure we're, again, looking at the future of direct potable reuse, of advanced water treatment at the plant. So again, this is all going to drive where these capital projects are going, rather than, different purple pipe projects, unless they're really close and make sense, perhaps, et cetera, et cetera. If a customer comes asking, we can consider it. And now going back to, the current budget that we've been talking about, maybe as we come back to another workshop in your expenses, perhaps staff could look at how could you reduce some expenditures, at least give us some scenario of another $500,000 to $1 million, because that was something that was discussed back around slide 11, give or take, of expenditures that are built into this cake right now. So I think if staff can come back when we have that next discussion, on those options 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, is, well, where could we actually potentially cut back more within the organization to reduce those costs? Because on the other side of the coin are the capital improvement projects, which there's a bunch of them right now that are on the books, and I think they're sort of budgeted, and yet we're not all in the same boat here that those are the ones we should be pursuing this year, and we still have not solidified that discussion. And I think that's all on all of this. I really do appreciate it. I think we should have, another, whatever it takes, 1 or 2 more workshops, before we're going to get to the finish line here into June. But those are my concerns, and I think we've been having robust discussion this year on it. And then separately, my last comment, Mr. President, is just for the general manager. I would ask, and I emailed him yesterday, and so I was working on it, but can you send us something, Greg, just as to how the new announcement from Metropolitan impacts or does not impact West Basin? Those of us on the board know, for the most part, how it does or does not, but the average person does not. So can you just provide us a quick synopsis at some point, hopefully maybe today? So if we start getting questions, because I know a lot of people are going to have a lot of questions now that that's front and center in the media today. So I'd like to make sure that we're well aware of how that actually impacts West Basin service area or how it does not at this moment. And with that, I really say thank you, and thanks to everybody, Margaret, your team, and Darren and Luis. Is it Luis? Louise. I'm sorry. But thank you. You all have been excellent today. So I appreciate that.
Are there any other comments from board members?
President Deere,
Director Gray, go ahead.
thank you. I just, again, I came on a little late on the call, but I did hear certainly the majority of the conversation, and Director Houston just did a lot of comments and had questions, so I don't have anything to add, but just to say thank you to Margaret and for the presentation this morning, and I'm sure we'll continue to have discussion on those projects, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Margaret, I think we completed our presentation. An excellent presentation as usual. We've been meeting for 2.5 hours, so I want to close this meeting off as soon as possible. There are no closed session items, Mr. Reed, right?
There are no closed session items, President Deere.
Okay, and we're under director's comments to my colleagues. Any comments? Or any further comments, I should say? Apparently not. So if there's no further business, we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to staff. Thank you, Margaret, for a great presentation. And thank you to our team from PFM.